Up until the time of the Second World War, the Royal Navy was still the largest, most powerful naval force in the world. Permanent fleets were maintained in the Mediterranean, stretching from Gibraltar, Malta to Alexandria. The East Indies fleet spanned from Aden, Colombo to Singapore. Also, fleet dispositions were to be found on the China and America West Indies stations. Indeed, it could still be truly said that Britannia did rule the waves. At the outbreak of World War II, many warships in service with the Royal Navy were originally built during the Great War, and apart from the Nelson and Rodney, all the battleship classes were from this era. During the 1930s, the Queen Elizabeth class underwent a program of extensive modernization, but the Royal Sovereign R-class battleships virtually remained in their original state. What you are seeing here is the Queen Elizabeth herself leading the fleet at the Spithead Review in July of 1924. The names of many of these battleships, like Royal Oak, Ramillies, Revenge, Resolution, were well known throughout the entire nation, being looked upon with great national pride, and fleet reviews of Spithead by King George V were very big occasions. The Royal Yacht was the Victoria and Albert, which first entered service at the turn of the century, and it was not until as late as 1954 that she was eventually broken up. This is the forecastle of HMS Hood, filmed in 1923. She was then only 3 years old, but already the pride of the fleet, and certainly one of the most handsome warships ever built. In November of that year, along with HMS Repulse and 4 cruisers, she embarked upon a goodwill tour which circled the globe, and this journey lasted until September of the following year. There was a film made of this entire event, which runs for 106 minutes, but unbelievably, these few scenes you are watching here are almost all of the few sequences which were devoted to the warships. Sadly, vague and obscure personalities from many distant lands completely dominate this silent film, the consequence of which results in a very boring visual production. It is perhaps worth pointing out that the quarterdecks of these battle cruisers were continually awash throughout most of their service careers, and no doubt many crew members learned this from first-hand experience. Having warships partake in complete journeys around the world was, in itself, a very rare occurrence, but each year the home fleet would invariably embark upon a spring cruise to Gibraltar, though the term cruise should not be taken to imply that such occasions were leisurely in manner. Ship's companies were very busy, performing all the many tasks necessary in maintaining their ships at a high peak of efficiency and appearance. Also, as you are about to see, when meeting with units from the Mediterranean station, war game exercises were perhaps the most important feature of the event. Arriving back in Gibraltar, the crews were able to relax from the tensions of complex sea exercises, and a heavy emphasis was placed upon recreational activity in many forms of sport, leading to great inter-rivalry between the various ships of the fleet. But one very popular form of recreation did not quite fit this category. It was the daily issue of rum. The Mediterranean fleet was maintained to a very high standard, with ships remaining on station for an average of 2.5 years before returning to their respective home ports. At sea, in the splendor of its light gray paintwork and shining brass, the fleet was a very imposing and majestic sight. In those bygone pre-war years, the harbor basin at Gibraltar was frequently inhabited by large numbers of warships. And from high vantage positions on the rock, the view must have been awfully awe-inspiring. In May of 1937, many units of the Royal Navy set sail for Spithead to be present for the coronation review by King George VI. And this was to be one of the last great gatherings ever of warships before the start of World War II, which would also prove to be the greatest challenge ever faced by the Royal Navy. Representing the many Royal Navy vessels present at this massive review were 8 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, 5 aircraft carriers, 16 cruisers, 60 destroyers, 22 submarines, and 4 depot ships. Also, 17 warships from various foreign navies. It was indeed a memorable event. After the coronation review, the dark clouds of war rapidly became imminent, and during the last week of August 1939, the Admiralty secretly sent the home fleet to its war station, which was essentially Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, though smaller units were assigned to Rosyth, the Humber, and Portland. This natural fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow was ideally situated to help guard against German warships breaking out into the Atlantic via the Denmark Strait and the Iceland-Faroe Isle Gap. Three of the major warships which sailed to the Orkneys on that occasion can be seen here: the Ark Royal, Repulse, and the Hood, which in this instance is the camera ship. Generally, during the immediate following months, little would be heard about these ceaseless patrols in the very inhospitable waters of the far north, for the Royal Navy was certainly living up to its reputation as being known as the Silent Service. Before the end of 1941, Ark Royal, Repulse, and the Hood would be sunk. Without any doubt, the Royal Navy was about to embark upon a long and hard bitter struggle of such proportions it is highly unlikely to ever experience again. Of the three battle cruisers, only Renown, which remained the fastest capital ship in the Navy, survived the war, as did the battleships Nelson and Rodney. And here we will try to present a brief profile of the many types of warships which saw service during World War II. The five battleships of the QE class is represented here by HMS Warspite, as she appeared in March of 1942 off Trincomalee. Of this class, only the Barham was lost, and this incident will be seen in a subsequent episode. HMS Revenge was one of the five battleships of the Royal Sovereign class, and of this group, the Royal Oak was the only casualty, being torpedoed in the fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow by the adventurous U-47. Yet two-thirds of her ship's company were lost. Five battleships of the KG-5 class were built during the war, and it is the KG-5 herself that can be seen here sailing in the Pacific during 1945. By coincidence, only one of this class was also lost, HMS Prince of Wales. The aircraft carriers of the pre-war years were somewhat of a mixed-bag collection, with most being previously designed as some other class of ship. One such was the Furious, originally launched in 1916 as a light battle cruiser. The hull of HMS Argus was initially destined to have been an Italian passenger liner. Both these two old carriers did survive the war. HMS Eagle, seen here, was not so lucky. She was torpedoed in the Mediterranean during August of 1942. HMS Hermes was sunk by Japanese aircraft in April of the same year. Two sister carriers were the Courageous and Glorious. The former was sunk by U-29 in the first month of the war, while Glorious was in May of 1940, along with the two destroyers, Ardent and Acaster. This was due to tragic and very foolhardy circumstances, which resulted in their being caught by the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. There were pitiful few survivors. HMS Ark Royal was launched in 1937, and embodied in her construction was all the past experience of carrier development. Her wartime exploits became legendary, and she was sadly missed after being torpedoed amidships only a few miles off Gibraltar in October of 1941. This is the launch of HMS Indefatigable. She was one of 6 carriers of the wartime-built Illustrious class. They all eventually served with the British Pacific Fleet, and in fact remained in commission until the mid-1950s, except the Victorious. She was not broken up until 1969. This is HMS Illustrious herself, underway in the Indian Ocean during the year of 1944. Several light fleet carriers of the Colossus class were built, and they also served with the BPF. But considering the Navy did not regain control of the Fleet Air Arm from the Royal Air Force until 1937, it is hardly surprising that due to lack of specific carrier aircraft development, most of the BPF carrier squadrons were equipped with American Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs. Some 40 American-built escort carriers of a temporary nature served in the Royal Navy, the Archer, Attacker, and Ruler class, 2 of which are to be seen here, HMS Biter and HMS Striker. The strength of the Royal Navy in September of 1939 was something approaching 60 ships, though more than a third of these were in the region of 20 years of age. The new Idaho and Colony class were building, but even when they all eventually became available, there would never be enough of these heavily overworked ships. Of almost 30 would not survive the war. The C&D classes were the oldest serving cruisers, and their construction design proved to be the most durable, in their being able to give almost 30 years of rewarding service. Of some 21 of these cruisers, 9 became a war loss. One of the 2 E-class cruisers was the Enterprise, seen here at Plymouth in December of 1943. The previous year, in the Indian Ocean, she helped in the rescue of survivors from the Dorsetshire and Cornwall. This is HMS Frobisher, one of another old group from the First World War period. She also served with the Eastern Fleet. In the late 1920s, a new type of cruiser came into service, the County class. 13 were built, of which 2 served in the Royal Australian Navy. With their exceptionally high freeboard, they were extremely stable and dry in the heaviest of weather. From this same period came the York class, comprising of only 2 ships, neither of which survived the war. HMS Exeter is profiled here, shortly before sailing on her ill-fated voyage to the Far East, after repairing extensive battle damage sustained with the Graf Spee. HMS Ajax of the Leander class also took part in the Battle of the River Plate, while one of her sister ships, HMS Neptune, was lost with only 1 survivor after running into a minefield with Force K off Tripoli. In the mid-1930s came 4 ships of the Arethusa class. 2 would be lost, the Galateer and Penelope. After a superb war record, HMS Aurora was sold to the Chinese Navy in 1948, where she became the sad victim of a dismal and somewhat obscure fate. This is HMS Penelope, filmed here shortly before being sunk by U-410 off Anzio in February of 1944. Hit by 3 torpedoes, she quickly sank with very heavy loss of life. It was indeed a sad end to this fine cruiser with a superb war record. The last of the pre-war cruisers were the handsome Southampton class and the 2 modified versions, HMS Edinburgh and Belfast. 4 would be gone within the first 3 years of war, with possibly HMS Gloucester being the most tragic. She was sunk off Crete in 1941, having left the UK before the war to join the East Indies fleet. There were few survivors. Classic eyes of the Dido light cruiser class are well illustrated here by HMS Euralis. The Mediterranean would be their main theater of operations, from which the Bonaventure, Naiad, and Hermione did not return. This appears to be HMS Diadem, one of the 5 modified constructed Dido class. Another, HMS Spartan, was sunk by a radio-controlled glider bomb off Anzio in January of 1944. Diadem went to the Pakistan Navy in 1956. The final era of the truly big gun cruiser were the Colony and Minotaur classes, an example of which is seen here as the camera pans the starboard beam of HMS Mauritius. According to historians, she had the dubious distinction of serving more warrants than any other cruiser during the war. Capable of 40 knots were the 6 Abdil-class mine-laying cruisers, and this is the Abdil herself in September of 1943, actually sailing to her tragic fate with appalling loss of life in the harbor of Taranto. At the outbreak of the war, the Royal Navy possessed some 184 destroyers, and before the end of 1945, a further total of some 250 would have been built. The tremendous demands placed upon these maids-of-all-work by the events of war resulted in considerable losses, with approximately 130 being shattered and sunk. Rapidly approaching the camera is HMS Blank. She did survive the war.
Starboard steady. Bring toast ready.
The oldest destroyers in service were basically the well-tried and trusted VNW class, the origins of which dated back to the Great War. Typical of the peacetime-built fleet destroyers, H-23 was HMS Echo. She was transferred to the Greek Navy in 1944. Lost early in the war after striking mine in the North Sea was H-15, HMS S. The Idol was all sunk on this same occasion, and in the subsequent program much will be seen of this light destroyer. HMS Encounter, H-10, was lost far from home in the Battle of the Java, the cruiser Exeter and the American destroyer Pope. The designed J's and K's were just beginning to enter service commencement of hostilities. HMS Jackal in here was sunk by aircraft 2 other destroyers, Kipling and Riley, in the Mediterranean in May of 1942. This is alleged HMS Kelly. HMS Kelvin, filmed at speed, was another ship of the same class. She was broken up in 1949. Of the original 16 Tribal-class destroyers, only 4 would survive. 2 were HMS Eskimo and F-36, HMS Nubian. The first destroyer completely enclosed by the L's, represented here by the ill-fated MS Lightning. Wartime construction would progress throughout the alphabet, excluding X and Y, with 8 of each class built by 32 C prefixes and number of battle class. From the 17th, this is HMS Off. G-10 was HMS Pathfinder, badly damaged by Japanese aircraft. She sailed all the way back to the UK on her starboard engine only, but she was never repaired. Various types of camouflage was frequently adopted in parts of the world, and such scheme is displayed here by HMS Relentless. A small escort destroyer was designed which could be built quickly and in large number. This was the Hunt class. A total of 86 were constructed in the first 3 years of war. HMS Haythrop, seen here at anchor, was lost off the brook in March of 1942. This rare film sequence affords a marvelous opportunity to see much of the Hunt-class destroyer's detail as the camera slowly ports side of HMS Catterstock.
Do you hear that? Second part of starboard watch to muster in the canteen flat. Leave it up as this is will be piped at 0620.
In the relentless waging of war against the U-boat, many other ships of the various corvette classes were used. U-45 HMS Wild Goose was a sloop of Black Swan class. Formed into strategic escort groups, these ships played a large part in what became known as the Battle of Atlantic. Funded by Captain Walker, this is the legendary Glade Excelling. Built on whale catcher lines, the number of Flower-class corvettes approached almost 300, and life aboard these small ships was very hard and demanding, escorting convoys far out into the North Atlantic, as will be seen in a wartime documentary feature in a later episode. As also, more will be seen of this incident of 4 Bangor-class minesweepers actually in the act of capturing the Italian submarine Bronzo during the Sicilian landing operations in July of 1943. Hundreds of trawlers came under Admiralty command, and their various assignments were quite wide and diverse. The Tree class, however, seen here, were almost exclusively used for minesweeping. Gunboats were almost a dying breed by the time of World War II, and of the last group fall in 1939, only HMS Locust, pennant T-28, survived. The Dragonfly and Grasshopper were lost at Singapore, and the fourth, HMS Mosquito, was sunk at Dunkirk. This is a brigand-class fleet tug, and in pre-war days, they were used principally for target towing. But rendering assistance to many damaged ships quickly became their wartime priority. Astonishingly, when the war ended, the Royal Navy had nearly 3,000 various types of warships in commission, and this program, it has only possible to reprofile all but a few, like this Fairmile steam-driven boat, HMS Grey Wolf. The class variations of the Fairmile were quite extensive, though most of them were constructed of wood and petrol-driven. Used collectively with other craft, special bases were created around the coasts, and it was all given the title heading of Coastal Forces. This is a Type B Fairmile seen at the Lioness Destroyer anchorage at Scapa Flow. Coastal Force craft were usually commanded by volunteer reserve officers, and the crews of many motor torpedo boats were often inclined to regard themselves somewhat deep from the mainstream naval discipline codes and regulations, which of course they were of this fast-moving, adventurous type of work. This rare brief film view of H-49 ends before one can barely mention that she was lost off the coast of Holland in October of 1940 with only one survivor. HMS Uproar, seen here returning to base, was more fortunate, being one of the naked war. The South were probably the mid-1940 and Joe, HMS Snapper, turned into their depot ship HMS Forth at Dundee. The Snapper was lost with all hands the following year. In fact, 74 British man submarines lost during World War II, and for appalling total, only 28 officers and rates known to have escaped and survived from their involvement in the Atlantic boats. And included in this figure are 6 crew members from HMS Umpire, which accidentally rammed and sunk in the North Sea in July of 1991. The war brought a great infusion of Naval Reserve and conscript personnel into the service, which in turn created a profound and lasting effect on the regular lower-deck Navy. However, the boys' service continued in much the same manner as in pre-war years. Here are such a group from the old training ship Implacable learning seamanship. It is not generally realized that many of these young boys were lost at sea during World War II.
Ships coming in. Send out. Ease.
This wartime parade on the front at Southsea includes a contingent of sea cadets, the joining of which brought me my first ever pair of long trousers. The strength of the Royal Navy in 1939 was in the order of 10,000 officers and 109,000 ratings, which would eventually peak to over 860,000. This massive influx of the hostilities-only recruit would place a severe strain on the Navy's traditional infrastructure relating to the very wide social gulf between the upper and lower decks. And though discipline was essential, the KRs and AIs were many times strictly enforced to guard against any such incursions. Here, King George VI inspects a parade of new recruits at Chatham Barracks, the playground of which I personally doubled across on numerous occasions, for walking was never permissible. With so many ships being made available for war service, regular naval personnel had to be thinly stretched to enable their experience help form the hard nucleus of his company, which was now becoming increasingly manned by the new recruits. Captains would be loath and indeed unwise to take the ships operationally to sea until the new inexperienced crew members found their sea legs. It wasn't unknown for people to be washed overboard and drowned on their very first voyage. Here we can see a new crew practicing seaboat drill on the destroyer Katies. She was later sunk on a Russian convoy operation with the loss of over half her ship's company. In spite of the nation being shocked by the tragic early sinkings of the Courageous and Royal Oak, the first months of the war became known as the phony period, a belief sustained by the lack of any real aggressive combat between the opposing forces on the continent. Armed merchant cruisers were brought into service as the Admiralty quickly requisitioned some 50 passenger liners to help supplement the urgent need for more ships, as the Navy strove to enforce a blockade against Germany by keeping a continuous sea watch on the waters between the Shetlands and Iceland. As this vigil was maintained, events would occur in Norway and France early in the new year, which would rapidly bring this so-called twilight period to a close. The implementation of convoy systems was one of the first priorities of the Admiralty, and with Britain alone possessing some 3,000 merchant ships, this was a complex, frustrating problem, especially as these ships were widely spread around the world and the shortage of escort vessels was so acute. Troop convoys, however, were normally assured of a reasonable escort, and frequently a battleship was in attendance to guard against the risk of attack by German surface raiders. This appears to be one such convoy with HMS Resolution as part of the escort. Battleships spent on average 25 days at sea during each of the first 4 months of the war. On the 21st of August 1939, the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee sailed in secrecy from her home port of Wilhelmshaven, placing herself conveniently in the South Atlantic to attack British merchant shipping during the early months of the war. And this she did, sinking a total of 9 ships until, on the morning of the 13th of December, For many weeks, the Royal Navy had been searching in vain for the Graf Spee, but soon, early on this Wednesday morning, Commodore Harwood's cruiser force of Ajax, Exeter, and Achilles were to have their first contact. At 0610 hours, smoke was sighted just above the horizon. The action with the Graf Spee had been broken off at 0740 hours, and by midnight she was anchored in the Montevideo roads, sailing into port early the following morning with her 37 dead and 57 wounded crew members. Damage was not so extensive as was that to HMS Exeter, for she had received 7 major hits, and as she limped towards the Falkland Islands, some 60 officers and ratings were buried at sea. The Ajax and Achilles, damaged to a lesser extent, remained on station as the Navy sought desperately to rush reinforcements to the area. In the event, these reinforcements were not necessary, for regardless of them being unable to arrive in time, the Graf Spee sailed early in the evening of the 4th day, heading towards the open sea, but upon reaching the river's estuary, she blew herself apart. HMS Achilles arrived back in New Zealand, and in Auckland she received a tumultuous welcome. On a dull, dreary day in February of 1940, HMS Ajax returned to her home port of Chatham, from which she had sailed 2 years previously under the command of Captain
We all
Woodhouse.
consider ourselves very lucky to have had an opportunity of meeting an enemy ship at sea.
On an equally dull and drab day, the battered cruiser Exeter returned home to Plymouth, where Captain Bell and his crew were greeted by a large excited crowd. Certainly the Battle of the River Plate was a relatively small affair when compared to many other sea battles past and present. But it did give the people of this nation a wonderful uplift during that first dark, gloomy winter of war. Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, was also present to ensure a maximum degree of morale would be extracted from the occasion, in spite of Exeter's many battle scars being visible for all to see. On the 23rd of February, both ships' companies were honored and paraded in London to the Horse Guards Parade. It was a magnificent spectacle. Many captured British merchant seamen had been transferred from the Graf Spee to her supply ship Altmark, and en route back to Germany, she was intercepted in a Norwegian fjord and boarded by the destroyer Cossack. This brief excerpt from a German newsreel clearly shows their displeasure.
Den die Geschichte der neuen Zeit kennt. Der deutsche Dampfer Altmark wurde von dem englischen Zerstörer Cossack gegen jedes Völkerrecht mitten im Kjörsingfjord tief in den norwegischen Gewässern überfallen. 7 deutsche Seemänner wurden ermordet, Einer wird vermisst und viele andere wurden durch die heimtückischen Schüsse der englischen Seeräuber schwer verletzt. Ein Taucher untersucht die Schäden, die das Schiff erlitten hat. Die wilde Schießerei, mit der die Briten die unbewaffnete Altmark überfielen, hinterließ überall Einschlagsspuren.
Arriving at Leith on the 17th of February, the Cossack had on board 299 liberated prisoners. Her name and that of her commander, Captain Vian, became a legend.
Well, after an imprisonment of about 9 weeks, our great moment came at about 10:30 at night, when, after a few hours of tense expectation, we heard the hatch being opened, and a cheerful British voice calling down, "Are there any Englishmen down below?" "Yes," we shouted. "Then we're a British warship come to rescue you," he told us. We cheered loudly. We got all our arrangements made. We filed up on deck, and there were the Navy in complete control, all the Marines with Germans in front of them. The Marines with fixed bayonets. Everything was orderly and arranged perfectly. We waited on deck, then the destroyer came charging alongside. We came right up to the side of the ship. We clambered aboard, and there we had a great welcome from these great gallant fellows who'd made this wonderful and courageous attempt, which had succeeded in rescuing us from our very unpleasant position.
3 cheers for the lads on the Cossack and the British Navy for the smart way in which they saved us. And God bless them. Hip, hip.